Hello there, hope you're doing great. Welcome to another session on PHP. In this session, we'll be focusing on the use of sessions in PHP. So even before going into the technicalities on sessions, let me explain session with a very plain, simple example. So let's consider this scenario. So it's like, let me first build the wall here. And here is Professor Satish. Yeah, it's a weird scenario, but let's take up this scenario to understand the use of sessions exactly. So Professor Satish is here and he's going to teach three students. Say we have three students who are hiding behind this wall. Student, student, and student. So the challenge here is Professor Satish cannot see these three students. They are like hiding behind a wall. And each of these students will be learning a different subject. Say maybe the first student is on PHP, the second student is going to be talking about Java, is learning Java, and the third student is on database management systems. So it's like every time a student asks a question, Professor Satish should reply to that student. So it can be, can you please tell me the marks? Then Professor Satish should give the mark for that student in that specific subject. And this entire communication happens behind the wall. See, the student and the professors are not in the same room. They cannot see each other. So how this communication can still happen without any issues? So let me tell you what Professor Satish does now whenever a student first initiates the communication. Say student 1 just starts the communication, and this communication, let's assume that it's voice based. So maybe student 1 starts the communication, says, "Hi, Professor Satish." Let's say student, the very first student initiates the communication, just introduces that his name, and then says he's here for learning PHP, and Satish is able to hear that student. So what now Satish does is he just creates a file for the student, and then he writes the student name, whatever name that student, say his name is Sam, and then he also assigns him a registration number, say some registration number like 12BCE001. So this will be the name for the file, 12BCE001, and then you can also put some data like the course taken by the student is PHP. So what Professor Satish does is, once when the student initiates a communication, tells his name for the first time, he creates a file, gives him a unique registration number, and then he also tells the student that this is your registration number, 12BCE001. So that is the very first communication. Student says an I, tells his name, and then Professor Satish opens a file, puts his name, and assigns a registration number, identifies the course that this student is, and he also names the file with this registration number. Now Satish tells the student, okay, this is your registration number. That will be very unique for this specific student. Likewise, when the student initiates a communication, what Satish does is he creates a new file for that student, gets his name. Say two students can have the same name, so name can be Sam for the student too. And now you gives a registration number. Registration number is unique, so 12BCE002, and the course, whatever course pertaining to the student, say Java. He writes to the file the data for the student, and then he can also give back the registration number. He tells the student, see, from now on, if you ask a question, just ask me a question. First, tell me your registration number, right? Likewise, for the student, when the student initiates a communication with Professor Satish, what he does is he creates another file for the third student, and then he's going to have the name for the student, say name is Harini, and then course is DBMS. Now he assigns a registration number for this student, which is unique. Say the file name is 12BC003, and it tells the student, okay, Arini, this is your registration number, that is 12BC003. And from now on, whenever you initiate a communication with me, first tell me your registration number. Okay. So this is how this entire scenario is maintained. And say let's talk about the very first student. He comes back and he posts a question. So when he is posting a question, the very first thing that he'll be giving back is registration number 12BC001. And then he posts the question. The question is, tell me the course I have registered with you. Say, that is the question. Now Professor Satish will use this registration number, go to that specific file, find the course and respond to the student. The course is PHP. You understood? So this file is created and it is maintained for every student. The purpose for creating this file is tracking students. So we are tracking every student using this file. Why is that we are doing that? Because we can't see them in person. So we need a method to somehow track every student. So every student, when he comes and asks a question, what is the first thing he's going to give? He's going to give his registration number. And to maintain the data for the student, what is that we are doing? We are creating a file and then we are having a unique name for the file and putting the data for that student in that file. Whenever a student comes and posts a question, we'll take that file and give the data pertaining to that student back to him. Say when this student posts a question back, what is that he is going to give? He is going to give his registration number first, that is BCE0002, the full registration number. So Professor Satish identifies him, takes his file, answers whatever question he asks. So this is how this communication is maintained. And the same thing applies to servers and clients. Instead of student, you think a student to be a client system. And instead of Professor Satish, think Professor Satish as the server machine. So clients connect to the server. Every time a client connects to the server, there is a unique ID assigned to the client. And then from then on, every time a client asks a question to the server will be using the unique ID to fetch the data from the file and answer the server. So what is a session? A session is nothing but you track the client. And how you track the client? You create a separate file for the client on the server. And whatever information you want to store about that client, you'll be storing that on that file. And then whenever a client asks a question, it'll be coming out with that client ID or the session ID, and then it'll be posting the question. The server will use that file and then use the session ID to identify the file and respond to the client. That's how simple it is. So we're going to see how to create this session file and how to write the session back to the user. Let me erase all the ink on the slide. Now let us understand sessions from the client server perspective. We've already seen the scenario containing 3 students and Professor Satish. The same way, let's assume 3 clients. So here each client is like a student. We'll make a request for certain pages and we'll have a server here. Server is like Professor Satish. We'll be answering the queries of our clients. So this is client 1, client 2, client 3. Say client 1 starts the session. So it's going to make a request. Once when the request comes for a session, the server will create a file on a temporary directory, assign the session ID. Let's say the session ID is 123. And then if the user enters certain things like username or anything, you can very well put, okay, for this user, so the username is say Sam. So whatever data, say if the user enters username to be Sam and then request for a session, what is that we do? The server creates a file with a session ID. So this is a unique ID. It's a very long ID. For demonstration purposes, I've just given 123. And then it writes the data pertaining to the user. Say whatever data that can be written to this file. And then the server writes a cookie back. So it's going to write a cookie back saying that your session ID is 123. So this is actually a cookie maintained on the browser on the client side. in the last session, we have looked at cookies in depth. We have seen how to set cookies, delete cookies. So the same concept here. The server establishes that this is the client by writing a cookie back with the session ID. Likewise, when client 2 makes a request, say client 2 logs in with a username to be Ram. So this is the username, and client 2 requests for a session. What the server does is creates another file, but with a different session ID. Now say the session ID is 124, and then the username can be logged in using the session file. And now the server writes a cookie back, and what will be the session ID returned to the client? That will be 124. Likewise, when client 3 starts a request, another file is maintained by the server, and now it generates another session ID, that is 125, a unique ID for this client, and then it can write, say the username that's coming in is Matthew. So it will you can log in, like you can log that username as Matthew. So username is written to the file, and then the server writes a cookie back. So what is that cookie? It's a piece of information containing the session ID. So server has established ID for all the clients, and then it's maintaining 3 separate files for 3 separate clients, and each file is having data pertaining to that client. So what is the use of this file? Let's take a look at it. Say if this client is requesting another page now, and the server should respond with that page. Say whenever a client requests a page after the cookie has been set, now it will be sharing the session ID. Okay, this is my session ID. It's like every student first telling his registration number and then posting the question. The same way the session ID will be given to the server, and then the next page may be requested from the server. The server will use the session ID to get to that file and then also share that info pertaining to the client back to the client. So this is like, I need this info across multiple pages. I'll be able to use this info across multiple pages for a specific client. Say you log into a system, right? When you go to the next page, you're able to see your username displayed on the top of the page. How did that even happen? That's because we were able to pull your username using the session file. So what is the use of sessions in PHP? It's used for tracking a client. And how you track a client? Create a separate file for each client, assign a session ID to each of the files, and also write a cookie back to the clients with that specific session ID. So every time the client makes a request using the session ID, identify the client and share that info in the file that is pertaining to the client. So that is the use of sessions, and we'll be taking a look at a demonstration. We'll create a simple login page wherein the user will enter his username and password. Upon logging in, what is that we're going to show to the user is, we are going to show the employee details of that specific user. And we'll use this user ID for showing the employee details. And finally, when the user logs out, the session will be destroyed. What do you mean by destroying a session or log out? What does that exactly means? Say when there is a network issue, when there is no communication, or when the user logs out, the session should be destroyed. Destroying the session is nothing but killing the file. So you destroy the file. Once when the file is destroyed, from then on, no matter even when the client requests with a certain session ID, if there is no file maintained on the server is not going to honor your request. So once when the session is destroyed, that what's the meaning that? What is the meaning? You destroy the session IDs, you destroy the files. So every time a client establishes contact with the server, it will be a new session, and then on the communication will happen using that session ID. But once when the session is killed, there will be no use of the session ID any further. So that is what is called destroying a session. Normally we destroy a session when we click on logout. Let me show you the demonstration now. Let's first take a look at the output of a demonstration before actually coding it. So this is the demonstration on sessions. The user will be entering his username and password. So I'm maintaining username and password inside a MySQL table called user, which is present in the database Satish. And user ID is 121, password is my name Satish. So once when the user enters a valid username and password, a session is getting created. And you see here, welcome to employee management system. What do you mean by a session getting created on your server? Say, for example, you can see here a file getting created, that is the session ID. You can see a file with a certain session ID is being generated by the server, and this file is maintained here. And you can also view the contents inside the file. Right now I'm logging in the user ID that the user enters. What is the user ID? The user entered 121 into this file. So you'll be able to see the contents inside this file that the server writes. So here is the content. What is that the server has returned here? That is user ID is 121. So that's the user ID, and you see the session ID on top. So what is that we understand here is once when a session is created, a file with a session ID is created by the server, and the data pertaining to that particular client is written inside this file. And you see here, click on the button below to view your employee details. So now he's just clicking on the button, and is able to view only his employee details. That is employee details pertaining to user ID 121. Say in this page, the user has not entered his user ID again, but using his user ID, we were able to fetch the data for this particular user. That's because we were able to access the user ID from the session file and bring the data from the table. So in our table, we are having a separate table for employee, wherein 121, this employee ID is a foreign key mapping this user ID. And we are able to fetch the record for Satish using his user ID, and that user ID was retrieved from the file. So nothing to worry if you don't really understand how we are retrieving data or how we are writing data, because we'll be looking at the following things while we are coding this simple application. And finally, logout. Logout, as I told you, is used for destroying that file or killing that file. Once when logout has happened, there's no session ID and there's no further communication between client and the server using that session ID. So let me log out. So we have killed the session. What is the meaning? The file should be destroyed. So when you take a look at the temp folder on the server where we had the file on the session earlier, you see that session file is now destroyed. It's not there, so it's deleted. So there can be no communication between the client and the server using that session ID. And for the client to initiate any discussion with the server, it should start with a new session so that a new session file with a new ID gets created and the communication gets carried further. So that is with respect to session management, and we'll be seeing how to code this simple application. See, after killing the session, we'll not be able to traverse back and look at the details because the session file has been destroyed. So now we'll be looking at how to code this simple login system. Let's start with the demonstration now. So this demo is on use of PHP sessions. So we'll start off with a simple web page. We'll call the page as login page. So the user is going to log in using his user ID and password here. We'll create a simple form. Action is will be on the same page, and method is post. We're not going to have any JavaScript validation, but if you intend to have any validations, you can put that inside the codes here. That is, you can call the method for validation. I'm just returning true, and we'll have a label for user ID. So this is the label for user ID. We'll ask the user to enter your user ID, and this is input type text. Name we'll call this user ID, and we'll also have an ID. We'll call that to be user ID. Then a break. The next field is for the password. So we'll say it's a password, and enter your password. Now input type here can be password, but just for the demonstration purposes, I'll have it as text. Name to be password and ID to be password. Break. Finally, we'll have the submit button. Input type is submit, name is submit, and value will have that to be submit. So we are done with the form now. Let's take a look at the output for this form. So it is localhost 81 IWP test.php. So this is how our form looks, user ID and password, and then the user submits. So when the client requests this page, we should be starting off a session. So how is that we perform that? Let's go to VS Code. So we should have this session start code, the very first line of the page. So we'll be calling this method session underscore start. So when the client requests this page, session starts. What's the meaning of this? A session ID is created and then the session ID is sent to the client as a cookie. So we should have session start in the beginning of the page. Now upon submit, what is that we are going to do is we are going to have some PHP code which will validate this entry against a database. So first thing we'll check is we'll check whether the submit button has been set, and also we'll also include the connections, the functions that are related to establishing database connection and closing a database connection. So let's take a look at this code db.php. So this contains two functions. One function is for opening a connection and it returns the object of type MySQL, which is the connection object. And close connection gets this connection object and closes the connection. We've already seen how to connect with a database and work with all the CRUD operations using a MySQL database in our earlier sessions. If you're not clear with that, please refer to that and come to this session, because we'll be validating our user ID and password against an table in the MySQL database. So let's get back to our code. First thing what we're going to do is we'll include this db.php, the connection code, and we'll check whether the submit has happened. So we'll use this super global variable $_post and the name submit. If submit has been set, what we'll do, we'll get the user ID from the form. So we'll say this $user ID to be $_post, the user ID submitted by the user in the form. Likewise, we'll also get the password. So we'll call password as $password is equal to $post. And what is the name we have given for password in the form? It's password. So we have received the user ID and password in PHP. Now the next thing is we have to open a database connection. So it's we'll be calling this method from the file open connection. So it's open connection. So it opens a connection and returns a MySQL object that is represented as $conn. We have opened this database connection. The next step is we need to fetch the password from the database for the user ID that is entered in the form. So it's like this. We're just going to get the user ID and password from the form, and we'll fetch the user ID and password from the database for that user ID, and we'll be comparing the ID and the password with the ID and the password in the database. So simple login validation. So let's write a SQL query to fetch the user ID and password from the user table. So I have my table inside the MySQL database. So I have created a database with my name Satish, and I have this table which is present inside this database, and this table is called user table. It has user ID and password. So we should be fetching user ID and password using the user ID that the user has entered in the form. Let's construct the SQL query for this. So we'll be using the prepare method for our SQL query. So we have to select a user ID password from the user table where user ID equals question mark. So we'll be binding the user ID entered by the user in the form in the SQL query. So we are able to fetch the corresponding user ID and password for that user from the database. So prepare statement, what it returns an statement object. So we'll say that's the statement object, and the next step is we should be binding the parameters using the statement object. So statement, we'll call this method bind parameters, and we have to pass what is the type of the parameter. It's a string, and we're just going to get the user ID from the form. So this user ID is now binded to this query. So fetching the user ID and password for the user ID entered by the user using the form. Now what next we have to do is we have to execute this. We'll call dollar statement, and then the method is execute. So we execute the query, and we'll also fetch the result using the statement object. Dollar result is equals to dollar statement, and the method we are going to call here is get result. So we are going to fetch the result, and first check we are going to make is we are going to check whether the number of rows returned is greater than 0. So if dollar result returns num rows to be greater than 0, it means we have a match in the database for that user ID. What we'll perform here is we'll retrieve that row while dollar row is equal to. So it is using the method of the result class, that is fetch. We'll fetch everything as an associative array. So if you're not clear with what's happening here, please visit my lecture on database connection with MySQL databases using PHP, because we have discussed every statement here in depth in those lectures. I may be a little fast here because our concept is on understanding PHP sessions. So we'll make the comparison here. We'll just perform a string compare of the password that's coming from our database. So we'll say dollar row, and what's the password? That's user ID. So first we'll take the user ID. So we'll compare user ID with the user ID in the form. So that is dollar user ID. If this equals 0, then it means the user ID entered by the user matches the user ID in the database. Not only that, we should also compare the password. So we'll call string compare again, and then we'll call dollar row password. So this is the value from the table. So if this matches the value entered in the form, then we can say is a valid user. If he's a valid user, what we will perform next is we'll call this super global variable dollar session, and then we'll set the value for user ID to be the value entered by the user. So we are moving this value, the user ID, to the session file. We've already seen what a session file is. So this dollar underscore session user ID is equal to user ID. Say if the user enters user ID is 1 to 1, so the value for dollar underscore session user ID will be 1 to 1 in the session file. So we are moving some data pertaining to the user to the session, and since he's a valid user, we'll divert him to the welcome page. So location, that's it. So if the user ID and password from the databases matches the user ID and password entered by the user, we move the user ID to the session file, and then we also divert the user to the welcome page or the home page. Else, if the match is not happening, say the user enters some password which is not matching with the database password, we can just echo saying invalid user credentials. Kindly check your credentials. So it means they has entered some bad username or invalid username and password. Now the next scenario is, say we don't have any such user in the database. So while we are running a query, there is a match and the password is not matching, we say invalid credentials. But when we are running a query, there is no match. That is, the number of rows returned is not greater than 0. Then what we can say is, we can go with an else statement here. Else, we can say echo no such user found in our database. So there is no match for the user ID itself, then we can say no such user found in the database. So our simple login check is done. After all our database activity is done, we'll close the connection by calling close connection, and then we pass the connection object. So we are closing the connection here. So our simple login validation is done. What is it we are performing here? We are having a form asking the user to enter his user ID and password. On submit, what is that we do? Whenever the user requests this page, we start a session. What is the meaning of starting a session? Creating a session file and writing the session ID to the user's browser. Now we'll check whether the submit has been set. We'll also include some database connection code here, that is for establishing and closing a connection. We receive the user ID and password from the form. We open the database connection. Now we run a query. We are fetching the user ID and password from the user table for the user ID which has been entered by the user. So we bind the parameters, execute the query. If the user ID has got some rows, then what is that we do? We fetch the row as an associate array and we check whether the user ID from the database matches the user ID in the form and the password in the database matches the password entered by the user in the form. If it's a match, we move the user ID to the session file and also divert the user to an welcome page. Else, we say that you have entered invalid credentials, please check it. If there is no user with that specific user ID, we tell the user no such user found in the database. Finally, we close the connection. The important thing that we have to learn here is we have used session variables here. So we are moving the user ID to a super global variable called $_session, which maintains the user ID. So this will be actually writing the data to the session file. And we also start the session. We put that code in the very start of the page. The next activity is we are diverting the user to welcome.php. So we should complete coding welcome.php. So let's start coding welcome.php now. So we're going to work with sessions. The very first line of code we are going to have here is we're going to start the session. So it's a session start. Because we're going to access the session file, get the user ID from the file here. And we'll start off with a simple web page. This is the welcome page for the user. And in this, we are going to have a simple form. So we're going to stay in the same page when the user submits the form. So it's welcome.php and method, we'll have that to be post. We're not going to have any JavaScript validations here, but just for the sake, I'm just saying return true. Just to remind you that if you want to have JavaScript validations, you can very well go ahead with that here. And what we are going to have in the form is we are just going to ask the user to click a button to know his employee details. So we'll say, we'll have an h2 tag. We'll say, click on the button below to view your employee details. And we'll have an input type to be button and input type to be submit and name to be submit and value to be submit. So our form is ready. Okay. The next thing is we'll complete our PHP code. When the user submits, what we should do is we should access the session file, get the user ID, get the details of the employee from the database. So say select star from employee where EID is equal to 1 to 1. So we are having the data pertaining to an employee in the employee table. So this is the user ID. So using the user ID from the session file, we are going to fetch the data for that specific employee and display this data on the web page. So let's code this one. So what is that we are going to check here? We are going to have our PHP code, and we will include our database file, that is db.php, which has got functions for establishing connection and closing a connection to the database. Now we'll check as usual whether the submit has happened. So we'll call this $_post, give the name for the submit button. If submit has happened, what is that we are going to do here is we are going to open the connection. So $connection is equal to open connection. It returns a database connection. The next step is we are going to write the SQL query and fetch the data for the employee. So for this we'll be using our prepare statement as usual, and here select star from employee where employee ID is equal to question mark, and connection, the prepare method actually returns an object of type statement. We'll capture that here. Next we'll bind the parameters statement. The method is bind underscore parameters and the type is string. So now we are going to fetch the details of this employee using the user ID in the session file. So how is that you access the user ID in the session file? We'll call the super global variable $_session, and then we'll pass the key for that. So $_session user ID. So this will have the user ID stored in the session file for this. So when you take a look at the session file, I just write it here. In the session file, you will have $_session and user ID. The value will be 1 to 1. So this is how the user ID will be stored in the session file. So now when I access this using the key, what will be the value here? That will be 121. So I'm just giving an example 121 here. So I'm just giving an example 121 here. So this value we have populated while the user was logging in. So we have populated this particular value in our login page. So here what we have done is when the user is a valid user, we are moving his user ID to the session file. So in the session file, $session user ID will be the value that the user has entered. If the user has entered 121, then this is going to hold 121. So that's what we are accessing here. He is a valid user. Now we are in welcome page and we need to fetch the details of that user. We're not asking the user to again enter his user ID. Instead, we go to the session file, get his user ID. So this is going to hold 121 if he has entered 121 in the login form. And next what we are going to do is we are going to execute the query. And get the result using the statement object get_result. The first check is we'll check whether the result object has got many number of rows returned, that is result num rows is greater than 0. Say only then it means that there is a match for this particular user ID in the database. So if the number of rows is greater than 0, we have found a match for that user in the database. Now we'll fetch and display all his details out. So we'll write the details as an HTML table back to the user. So it's a table. We'll set the border to be 1. And we'll start with the row. This is the header row. So we're going to have employee ID. Close the header row. Likewise, we have many close the column. Likewise, we have many columns, that is employee ID, name, phone number, salary, join date, and address. So we have 6 columns here. Let's have 6 header columns. So this is employee ID. Next one is name, and next one is phone, salary, join date. So we're going to have phone and salary and join date. Finally, address. So these are the details of the employee, and we have created the header row. Let's close the header row, close the quotes, semicolon. Now we'll fetch the row. No, we should not close the quotes here. That's the issue. Now we'll fetch every row while $row is equal to $result. We're going to call this method fetch associate. So we're going to fetch every row, and then we're going to write the rows as an HTML table again. So we'll start the row. We'll echo the columns. So we'll concatenate the data that's coming from the database here. So it's $row, and we have employee ID. We'll close this column. So like that, we have some 6 columns. Let's replicate this. So we have employee ID, name, phone, salary, join date, and address. After echoing the data for the employee, let's close the table. So what we have done here, we are fetching the data for the employee using the user ID that's populated in the session file. So if there is no such record in the database, what is that we have to do? We have to go with an else statement here. So if there are no records for the employee, we'll say no such employee found in our database. Finally, after all our operations, let's close connection. We'll pass the connection object. So we have done coding our welcome page, and there's one more thing. We should also give the option for the user to log out. Maybe in the form we'll have a reference to the logout page. Let's create that here. Let's have a reference and hyperlink to the logout page. So it call that logout.php, and we'll say it's logout, and we'll have a line. Let's take a look at our welcome page, how it looks. In line number 29, an expected variable dollar statement. Let's take a look at it. So we are missing this semicolon here. That should be the issue. Let's take a look at the output again. So here is this logout link, and then click on the button to view your employee details. When he submits, we'll be fetching the employee details from the database. Let's finish coding the logout.php. So let's code this logout. What is logout? Let's code this logout.php. So what is logout? We should be destroying the session. So for this too, we should first call the session underscore start. So that's the first statement. Even in your logout page, that should be called in the very first line. And then we'll call session underscore destroy to destroy the session. So what do you mean by destroying the session? The session file will be killed. That's it. And for the message, we'll say, thanks for using our system. You have been logged out. Some info will give to the user after he clicks on logout. We have finished coding our entire application. Now let's take a look at the output. Let's go to the login page. Let me enter a valid username and password. So the password is Satish. Now upon submit, we'll be taken to the welcome page. And we'll be able to view the employee details by using the user ID populated in the session variable. So let's click on submit. So using the user ID 1-to-1, we were able to fetch the data from the employee table for the specific employee. So this is where we are using sessions effectively. And after viewing the details, the employee can click on logout. So logout kills the session, that is, it destroys the file. And we finally get this message, thanks for using our system, you have been logged out. With this, we are coming to an end of this session. I hope you have a good understanding on how sessions are being used in PHP. If you have any questions, leave your comments below. And that's it for now. Thank you all for listening. Take care.